You already know there is something in your life that needs to change. Not in a vague, abstract way. Not in the way people talk about improvement when a new year begins and everyone briefly pretends they are about to become a different person. You know the exact thing. The habit that keeps repeating. The moment in the day when something shifts and the version of you that had plans, intentions, and clarity quietly disappears. You know when it happens. Maybe it's the moment you sit down to work and feel an almost magnetic pull toward anything except the thing that matters. Maybe it's the way your hand reaches for your phone without permission, scrolling through the same streams of information that never seem to satisfy anything, but are strangely difficult to stop. Maybe it's the project that sits half-finished, the routine that lasted 2 weeks, the version of yourself you promised you would become and somehow keep postponing. You know the pattern, and you also know the explanation you've been giving yourself for it. You tell yourself that you lack discipline, that you're not focused enough, that other people seem capable of consistency while you keep slipping back into the same behaviors you swore you would stop. It feels convincing because the evidence appears to support it. Every abandoned routine, every missed plan, every moment when you said you would start tomorrow. The evidence is real, but the conclusion you've drawn from it is almost certainly wrong, because what most people interpret as a failure of discipline is usually something else entirely. A failure of understanding. Specifically, a misunderstanding of how behavior actually works inside the brain. Most people believe that their daily actions are the result of decisions. You wake up, you decide what to do, you choose whether to work, exercise, focus, or procrastinate. And if you fail to choose the right thing often enough, the explanation seems obvious. You must be weak, unmotivated, inconsistent. But neuroscience tells a very different story. Much of what you do every day was never really a decision in the first place. It was a program. A behavioral loop that the brain stored long ago and now executes automatically. Without asking you. Without consulting your goals. Without caring about the promises you made to yourself the night before. This idea was explored in depth by Charles Duhigg in his book The Power of Habit, where years of behavioral research revealed something unsettling about human behavior. Habits do not live in the part of the brain responsible for conscious thought. They live somewhere older, deeper, inside a structure known as the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia does not reason. It does not evaluate your ambitions or judge the quality of your decisions. It runs programs. When a behavior repeats often enough in the same context, the brain begins compressing the entire sequence into a loop. A trigger appears. The behavior runs. A reward follows. And eventually the brain stops asking whether you want to do it. It simply executes the routine. Not because something is wrong with you, but because your brain is trying to conserve energy. Conscious thought is expensive. Every deliberate decision requires cognitive resources, attention, focus, self-control. If you had to consciously think through every action you perform each day, your mental energy would collapse within hours. So the brain does something remarkably efficient. It automates everything it can. Walking, driving, brushing your teeth, the route you take home from work, even the way you react to stress. Over time, these patterns become automatic scripts running quietly beneath awareness, which is incredibly useful when the habits are good, but deeply frustrating when they're not. Because once a loop is encoded inside the brain, it becomes incredibly difficult to fight using conscious effort alone. This is why people make promises to themselves at night and break them the next day. Why motivation feels powerful in the morning, but strangely disappears by evening. Why you can understand exactly what you should be doing and still find yourself doing the opposite. It isn't simply that your discipline failed. It's that your discipline was never the system in control. Something else was. And it was built long before you realized it. If you want to change your life, the real question is not, how do I force myself to behave differently? The real question is far more precise. What system is actually running my behavior? And more importantly, where inside that system does change become possible? Because here is the part most people never realize. There is one habit that quietly determines whether every other habit in your life succeeds or fails. One behavior that sits beneath productivity, beneath discipline, beneath motivation itself. A habit so subtle that most people never notice whether they have it. But once it develops, something strange begins to happen. Patterns that once controlled you start revealing themselves. Behaviors that once felt automatic begin slowing down just enough for you to see them. And the moment that happens, something shifts. Because the hardest part of changing a habit was never the effort. It was the blindness. The fact that the loop was running long before you realized it had begun. The habit that changes everything is the habit of seeing the loop, of noticing your own behavior as it unfolds, of observing the invisible triggers that quietly shape what you do. Most people never build this habit. They only notice the routine, the distraction, the procrastination, the bad decision. But by that point, the loop has already completed most of its work. The cue fired minutes earlier, the program loaded automatically, and the brain was already moving toward the reward it learned to expect. By the time you notice the behavior, you are already inside it, which means the first step in changing any habit is not discipline, it's awareness. The quiet skill of watching your own behavior with enough clarity to see where the loop actually begins. And that is where everything starts to change. The strange thing about habits is that once you begin looking for them, you start seeing them everywhere. Not just in the obvious behaviors like checking your phone or procrastinating on work, but in small moments you never questioned before. The way your day begins, the order of actions that follow, the subtle shifts in your mood depending on where you are, who you're with, or what time it is. What once felt random slowly starts revealing a structure. Because habits are not chaotic, they are patterns. And every pattern follows a design. Researchers studying human behavior discovered that nearly every habit, no matter how complex it appears, follows the same three-part structure: a cue, a routine, and a reward. This simple loop quietly shapes much of what you do every day. The cue is the trigger. The moment something in your environment signals the brain to begin a certain behavior. It could be a time of day, a location, a particular emotional state, the presence of other people, or even an action that happened just moments before. The cue tells the brain something familiar is about to happen. Then comes the routine, the behavior itself. This is the part most people focus on when they try to change their lives. They try to stop the action. They try to resist the routine. They try to overpower it with willpower. But the routine is only the middle of the loop. And fighting it directly is like trying to stop a river by grabbing the water with your hands. Because by the time the routine begins, the brain is already expecting the final part of the loop, the reward. Every habit exists because at some point the brain learned that the behavior leads to something satisfying. Sometimes the reward is obvious. A sugary snack tastes good. Scrolling social media provides stimulation. Watching videos offers temporary relief from boredom. But many rewards are far more subtle. You may check your phone not because you're interested in what's there, but because the brief distraction interrupts a feeling of stress. You may procrastinate not because you enjoy avoiding work, but because the delay provides a momentary escape from uncertainty. You may overthink not because the thoughts are helpful, but because the mind believes analysis will eventually produce control. The brain doesn't care whether the behavior is productive or destructive. It only cares whether the reward reduces discomfort. And once the brain associates a cue with a reliable reward, it begins building a shortcut. Next time the cue appears, the routine runs automatically. At first, the loop requires attention, but repetition changes something. The brain starts compressing the process. The cue appears. The behavior runs. The reward arrives. Eventually, the entire sequence happens almost instantly. This is when a behavior becomes a habit. And this is also when it becomes difficult to break. Because habits are not stored as decisions. They are stored as expectations. When the cue appears, The brain begins anticipating the reward before the routine even begins. This anticipation creates something powerful, a craving. The craving is what drives the behavior forward, not logic, not discipline, but the feeling that something satisfying is about to happen. This is why habits can feel almost physical. You don't simply decide to check your phone. You feel the urge. You don't calmly choose to procrastinate. You feel a pull toward distraction. The craving moves first. The behavior follows. Which explains why motivation alone rarely solves the problem. Motivation tries to fight the routine, but the craving is still alive. And cravings are stubborn things. They do not disappear simply because you tell yourself to stop. They wait. They persist. And eventually, when attention weakens even slightly, the loop resumes. This is why so many people believe they lack willpower. They assume that if they were stronger, more disciplined, or more determined, they would simply overpower the habit. But willpower is not the foundation of behavioral change. In fact, willpower is one of the least reliable tools for breaking a habit. Because willpower lives in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for conscious thought, planning, and decision-making. And that part of the brain is fragile. It tires easily. Every decision you make throughout the day drains a small amount of cognitive energy. What to eat, what to focus on, what to prioritize, what to ignore. Each choice uses a little more of the brain's limited supply of attention and self-control. By evening, many people are mentally exhausted, which is precisely when the strongest habits return. The brain falls back on automation. It reaches for the behaviors that require the least effort, the loops it has run thousands of times before, which is why someone can wake up determined to change their life and still find themselves repeating the same behaviors hours later. Not because their motivation disappeared, but because motivation was never the real mechanism controlling the habit. This realization can be frustrating at first, but it also reveals something important. If habits follow a structure, then they can be understood. And if they can be understood, they can eventually be redesigned. But redesigning a habit does not begin where most people think it does. It does not begin with discipline. It does not begin with forcing yourself to behave differently. It begins with something far quieter. The ability to see the cue, because the cue is the moment when the entire loop begins to unfold. And most of the time, you don't notice it. The cue is almost always invisible the first time you try to look for it. Not because it's hidden, but because it's ordinary. So ordinary that your mind stopped paying attention to it long ago. Think about how many things happen around you every day without you consciously noticing them. The background sounds in a room, the exact time on the clock, the subtle shift in your mood when something becomes difficult. These details fade into the background of awareness, and yet many habits begin precisely in those unnoticed moments. A certain time of day, a particular place, a feeling of boredom, a brief wave of anxiety, a conversation that leaves you slightly uncomfortable. These small signals quietly activate routines you've practiced hundreds of times before. And because the cue feels insignificant, the behavior that follows feels sudden. You look up and realize you've been scrolling for 15 minutes. You notice that the work you planned to do somehow never started. You find yourself eating, overthinking, procrastinating, or distracting yourself without remembering the exact moment it began. From the outside, it looks like the behavior appeared out of nowhere, but it didn't. The cue happened first. The brain simply recognized the signal before you did, which is why the habit of awareness changes everything. When you begin paying attention to the early moments of your behavior, something interesting happens. The pattern slows down, not physically, but psychologically. You begin noticing the signals that used to pass unnoticed. You start recognizing the situations where the same behaviors appear again and again. Maybe you realize that your phone habit always begins when work becomes slightly difficult. Maybe you notice that procrastination appears most often in the late afternoon when your mental energy drops. Maybe you discover that certain environments make focus almost impossible. The moment you start seeing these patterns, the habit loop loses some of its invisibility. And invisibility is what made it powerful. Because habits thrive in the background of awareness. They work best when the brain runs them automatically, without interruption. But awareness introduces something new. A pause. A small gap between the cue and the routine. At first, the gap is barely noticeable. The behavior still happens. You still follow the routine. But now you see it happening. You notice the moment the urge appears. You recognize the familiar feeling pulling you toward the same action. And even if you don't stop the behavior yet, something has already changed. The loop is no longer completely automatic. You are watching it. And observation alone begins to weaken its control. This is why the habit of self-observation is so powerful. Not because it forces change immediately, but because it reveals the structure of your behavior. Once you see the structure, the next step becomes possible. Understanding the reward. Most people assume the reward of a habit is obvious. If someone eats junk food, the reward must be the taste. If someone checks their phone constantly, the reward must be entertainment. If someone procrastinates, the reward must be laziness. But behavior is rarely that simple. The real reward often hides behind the surface action. Consider the habit of checking your phone. At first glance, the reward appears to be information. Messages, news, updates. But if you observe the pattern closely, you may discover something else. You might notice that the urge to check your phone appears when a task becomes mentally demanding, or when you feel uncertain about what to do next, or when you experience a moment of boredom. In that case, the real reward isn't information. The real reward is relief, a brief interruption of discomfort, a quick shift away from effort, a small psychological escape. Once you see the true reward behind a habit, the behavior begins to make sense. The brain wasn't trying to sabotage you. It was trying to solve a problem. It learned that a certain routine reliably produces a feeling it wants. So it repeats the solution whenever the cue appears, which leads to a surprising insight. If the brain only cares about the reward, then the routine itself is flexible.